All right, steps of speciation. So this is the second part of what we're going to do today. There's 3 steps: isolation, adaptation, and division. So for an example that I'm going to talk about, so imagine I took 4 or 5 of you, and I stuck you in this corner over here, and I've created a magic force field, and you are not allowed to leave that area. So you're stuck in this area, you can't leave. That is called isolation. Have y'all ever heard of isolation before? Like if you are on team isolation, does that mean you get to fraternize or talk with your friends and stuff? No, that's not what that means. It's the opposite of what that means. Isolation means you're separated. You're kept separate from the other people. Adaptation, what's the root word there? To adapt. So the organism has to adapt. They have to change over time. Now, remember, can an organism adapt on its own? Can an organism itself change? Say, hey, I want to be able to do better in this area. I'm just going to require less water because I'm a plant and there's not a lot of water here. I'm going to adapt. Is that what adapting means? Why is there a problem with that? Right. It takes a long time. Guys, individuals do not adapt. And if you need to type that out when we get to an adaptation, then you can. Individuals do not adapt. We're talking about genetics here. Individuals do not adapt. Species can adapt over large periods of time, but individuals do not adapt. That would be Lamarckism. Remember, we talked about Lamarck. Lamarckism says that an individual can adapt. But in Darwinism, what happens to an individual that it doesn't have the genes it needs to have? It dies. It's going to die. It's going to get eaten, or it's not going to get food, or something like that. And then we have the division. So let's talk about it. I'm going to write down isolation. Pretty simple definition or explanation. Isolation. It's separated by a physical obstacle. Now, if you want to go in more in depth in some of this, there are other obstacles that you can have. There's different things, but we're just going to talk about a physical obstacle. And you're going to have a project. It's kind of like a worksheet project. You're going to make your own species, and you're going to take that species through speciation. You're going to have a situation where they were separated by something. You're going to have them adapt, and then you're going to have a brand new species at the end. With this chipmunk, can y'all guess what it's separate? Like this was one chipmunk, this is another. 2 different species now. Guess what their separation was? The Grand Canyon. As if the river, the Colorado, I think it's the Colorado River that goes through, as if the Colorado River wasn't a big enough deal, the distance from one side, scaling the cliff down, getting across the river, continuing to go, and then climbing back up to the other side. Do you think chipmunks frequently moved back and forth from one side of the Grand Canyon to the other? No. And so that was what's the word? Their isolation was caused by a physical barrier that was the Grand Canyon. So there was distance, but there's also another reason. It was the think about the steep cliffs, the river, all that. Distance is a good isolator. If you think about down here where the hot air balloon is, if an organism, a small organism, say a fungus or something, was on one side of the river, it might adapt. If this river was wide enough, the one on this side might be isolated from the ones on this side. Or if you're on an island, say this island over here, this group of islands right here, compared to this one way out here. If this was a mile between islands, do you think organisms are going to frequently go back and forth between islands? No, they're isolated. And so now occasionally a lizard might get on some piece of wood as it's floating, and it might happen to go to that island. But it's not going to be movement back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Or a desert. This is an oasis in the desert at the bottom left. In that desert, if you're at one oasis and there's another oasis, which is like a watering hole in the middle of a desert, if you're 20 miles away, there's another oasis. Do you think the fish in this pond or the trees in this pond are going to be able to move back and forth between one oasis to the next? No. So they're isolated by distance and temperature and heat and lack of water. So those are physical obstacles, and these are all some examples of things that you might want to use for your project. All right, adaptation. What's the root word there?
Adapt.
To adapt. The population is going to write it down. The populations adapt to their surroundings. They adapt to their surroundings. And sometimes this can be biotic. the reason that they're changing is because of biotic reasons. Maybe a different type of food is available, or a different predator is there, or sometimes it can be abiotic. It could be temperature, it could be the amount of water that's available. It could be how much water is available in one time of year and how scarce it is at another time of the year. These are all reasons that an organism would have to adapt. Would a polar bear do very well in a desert? What about an island that is forested? Do you think a polar bear would do very well? Probably not. If you've ever seen Lost, that doesn't make sense for a polar bear to be on the middle of an island in the middle of the ocean. So those are all reasons that an organism might have to adapt. If I were to put, well, we won't go there. So camouflage could be an example of adaptation. How an organism moves around, if there's hibernation or migration that happens, how skittish an organism is, the colors of an organism for like mating and attractiveness to the other sex, opposite sex. All those things could be examples of adaptations. And then lastly, division. Eventually, there is enough going on between this part that was separated, like the two different parts of the species, two different sections of the species, the part that was isolated and the part that was just going on like normal. There was so much time and so many differences between the species, they no longer can or want to interbreed. So sometimes it's a can and sometimes it's a desire, like they're not attracted, there's not going to be interbreeding. So if you think about the Darwin's finches, and again in the video that I did before, Darwin's finches were separated by, like, on South America and then the different islands that he saw west of the South America. Those finches were related and similar, but they did not reproduce with one another because they'd been separated for so long. If you look at the hummingbird at the bottom left, see the plumaged, broad-tailed hummingbird or a rufous hummingbird. To me, those look the same. Like if I'm telling you, yeah, I saw a hummingbird, I would say, yeah, it looks like either one of those. So those are the same. But they see themselves as different because they've been separated for so long. They are a different species, and that happened because they were separated. They had to adapt differently, and now when you put them back together, they don't reproduce with each other. Here's an example. Y'all know what fruit flies are? Yes. All right, so they eat sugars. They eat things like fruit, bananas, maybe apple, stuff like that. They are going to eat fruit. So if you were to take fruit flies, and fruit flies, why would fruit flies be a really good example or a good thing to do an experiment on for generation after generation after generation? Yeah, guys, that word there is generation time. Their generation time is really short. So they're going to have babies really fast. So you could do several generations. Like if you did this experiment for a month or two, you'd have lots of generations of fruit flies. So they take a generation of fruit flies at the top, and they separate them. What is this stage called? Isolation. They're isolated from each other. Now, they only feed maltose. Well, now, if you ever see a word that ends with OSE, and that's like a noun, it's going to be a type of sugar. So sucralose or lactose, or in this case, maltose. It's a sugar. So they give this group maltose, they give this group starch. What if there are fruit flies over here that don't really digest maltose? No, they die. Remember, individuals do not adapt. Individuals die or they live. The species will adapt, yes. So maltose, if there's some that are like, hey, I'm maltose intolerant, well, you're going to probably die because that's all we've got to eat is maltose. And so over here, the same thing, but with starch. So over time, you have the same exact, you just randomly split them up. You have some over here and some over here. These ones are going to be eating starch. These ones are going to be eating maltose. Over time, let's say it's 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 generations later, these flies, ones that can't eat maltose over here or the ones that can't eat starch over here, they've all died out. Their genes, those genes have been wiped out. If they take them and they open these boxes and they introduce them to each other again, are they going to interbreed? They don't. They only, if you'll look down here in the picture, they took red ones with red ones and yellow ones with yellow ones. And it's not just because of the fly's color. There's also a genetic difference there now. Just like with the hummingbirds on the slide before. There's an actual difference, just like with the finches at the top. Over time, if things are separated for long enough, and they stay that way, they start to become different. If you think about this with humans, a very superficial way. Our ancestors, do you realize our ancestors, if you go back, let's say 5,000 years ago, our ancestors probably, very likely, stayed in their area, their village. They were born there and they died there. Y'all understand that? Do you think a person that was born in Germany, do you think they often went to Asia?
No.
How often do you think they came in contact with people from Australia? Rarely, if ever. So guys, we're very, very isolated. So if you go back to your genetics, there's a reason that your skin color is the way that it is. There's a reason that your hair type is the way that it is, that your eye color the way it is, that you have a propensity, you have a likelihood of having sickle cell if your ancestors are from a specific area, because we have been isolated for so long in that area. And it may be a larger region, maybe where there are some genetic changes, but it's in that region. So this happens in nature all the time. There's a separation, an isolation, there's a adaptation that happens, and then if that happens over long periods of time, they actually change to the point to where there's a division of the species. Now, guys, the things that I just mentioned, sickle cell, skin color, eye color, hair color, those are all very superficial. Can we breed with each other? Humans. Can somebody from Germany breed with somebody from Australia? Yes. Are they going to look just German or just Australian? Probably not. There's probably going to be a mixture of that happening. But if we were to do, let's say, if we were to leave Earth and go and some of us colonized another planet and we were separated for, 50,000 years, 100,000 years, 500,000 years, and then people were to come back, there might be so much difference between our species that was on Earth and our species that was in some other place. There might be such a difference that we can't or we don't want to reproduce. So therefore, we would have made a new species.